Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I want to thank everyone so much for joining me today and joining this iteration of our Three Revolutions webinar series. The Three Revolutions Policy Conference was set to happen in March 2020, but instead we've been able to host this series of webinars, which I think actually has been a real blessing. We've seen a lot of interest from the public, and we're really thrilled with being able to host these sessions. So this week's version is on rethinking public space during and after the pandemic. And I think this is a really absolutely important topic. And while it may not at first seem like it's related to the sort of three revolutions of shared, electric, and automated, we do see this issue as really critical. So I think one of the question that we posed to the audience is now the right time to talk about favoring people over cars, and it will be interesting to hear what you, the audience, and our speakers have to say about that. But we also want to talk about this idea of streets, because streets have perpetuated environmental, racial, and economic injustices. And so this panel is planning to focus on opportunities for public space to right some of those wrongs. We're planning to highlight examples where open streets are reclaiming streets from cars for people, in increasingly interesting uses, including, of course, just sitting and dining and shopping, watching live performances, exercising, and even learning on the street. And of course, all the good old-fashioned activities like playing, walking, or biking. So the question our panel will address is, what aspects of these street design experiments will pass as a fad after the pandemic, and what aspects may linger, what aspects may stay, and which of these are related to the pandemic, and which were sort of bubbling up before and aren't related. So that's what we want to discuss today, and we're planning on discussing examples of where cities are winning at taking back public space, and where missteps have occurred. So with that, I'll introduce our panelists in the order they will present. First, we have Kia Wilson, who is the senior editor at Streets Blog USA. Next, we have Chisara Brown. She's the Complete Streets City Planner for the City of Detroit. And Nico Larco, professor and director of the Urbanism Next Center and Sustainable Cities Initiative at the University of Oregon. I'm so pleased to have these really excellent speakers with you, and I'll stop there so we can really leave them enough time to get into it. So Kia, please, when you are ready, share your screen and you can begin your presentation.
Thank you so much, Molly. I really appreciate it. Let me go ahead and get myself all situated here and everything ready to go. Can everyone see my presentation now? Can I get a yes or a no, maybe?
It's a white screen.
It's a white screen, so we're not seeing the presentation.
Let's see what I can do here. All right.
Sometimes you need to switch screens. That sometimes works.
Yeah, I think we should be good now. Okay, let's get into presenter mode here. All right, I'm gonna minimize that. And basically, I'm very excited to be here. My name's Kia Wilson. As Molly said, I am the senior editor at Streets Blog USA. And for those of you who might not be familiar with Streets Blog, we are an advocacy journalism outfit covering the movements to make sustainable transportation our default. And we try very hard to do that through a mobility justice lens. And suffice it to say, this is a topic that has been my life for the past few months. I thought it would be useful to kind of just take us through a kind of quick and dirty historical tour of what we've been covering at Streets Blog, and as a way to sort of get an overview of how US cities have been implementing streets for pandemic response, how equity has featured into that, and how the conversation and critique of those movements has evolved between March and now. It's by no means a comprehensive overview, but just to give you a taste. So to take it way back to the beginning, early March of this year, mid-March of this year, COVID-19 struck. We had our first street closure, statewide lockdown in March, on March 19th in California. And just to give you a sense of how quickly the conversation turned towards how we need to ready our street realm to meet the challenges of COVID-19, both from a transportation perspective and from a public health perspective. I wrote an article on March 16th, 3 days before. I was not the only journalist to do this, advocating for quick-built traffic calming measures so that we could not overwhelm our hospitals. The urbanism world really seized on the COVID-19 pandemic as, for better or worse, an opportunity to talk about this agenda of how do we make our streets safer for people, because we recognized that pretty quickly we were going to have some real after effects from that. So by April 6th, I'm sure all of you have heard by now, vehicle traffic went way down. This is a map that we reported on at via streetlight data. Those bright yellow spots are places where traffic had fallen to as much as 94% of its previous level. Or, I'm sorry, it was down 94%, and some as little as 40, but really we saw these historical vehicle miles travel reductions. What that amounts to, as most people on this call will probably have already heard, is car crash rates went way up, because the fewer cars that are on the road to slow traffic, the higher the number of vehicle speeding and vehicle collisions you're going to have, even if there is a vanishingly few number of cars on the road. And by now we've actually seen it reported by NHTSA that we have hit a 15-year high for crash rates around the country. We also saw these accompanying changes in mobility more broadly. So I know one of the 3 revolutions is shared mobility. A lot of that went away overnight, especially in the micro mobility realm. So Lime and Bird scooters both pulled their fleets off of the streets, especially in that era when we weren't so sure about the role that surface transmission played in transmitting the virus. And of course, we saw some really big changes in transit. I cannot tell you how many times I have typed the words death spiral in the last few months, but transit, of course, fell way off. But it didn't fall off uniformly. Who was moving and who was not moving was, from the very, very early days of this pandemic, pretty clear. So this is from Transit App. I've cited this study a lot over the last few months and written it up several times. 92% of people who are still using public transit in late April are using it to commute to work. They are disproportionately people of color, they are disproportionately women, and they are disproportionately in low-paying fields like food prep, grocery, healthcare support. We don't have the same data by April about who is driving versus walking, but what we do know is that there's a bubbling conversation around who is struggling with mobility during this time, what are the variables that we need to be considering in, and we have a lot of uncertainty around both. That said, my field, and particularly it has to be said, white-led urbanism organizations like mine, were very, very, very quick to say, but we can wait until all the science is in, until we know exactly how COVID-19 is transmitted, until we know exactly which population groups are affected, or we can recognize that we have a crisis right now, which is a twin pandemic of increased car crash rates, and we need to act on that. There are some things that we regret about this now, and must be said. So on March 17th, we were starting to publish op-eds by folks like Sam Balto out in Portland, where Nico lives, making the case for opening streets for neighborhood social distancing. By March 29th, we were publishing articles like this on The Right, which was actually a guy named Stephen Vance, a private citizen, had compiled a crowdsourced Google Doc of by now it's almost 300 separate cities. Many of them are official initiatives, some of them are civilian-led, who have tried some sort of tactical urbanism, slow streets, open streets, some sort of modification to the street realm in order to better accommodate the needs of the citizens during the pandemic. This is an article that I read now, and I am excited to build on what I've learned because I didn't know very much. I think every journalist in my position got a pretty serious and swift education, especially if they're white and they didn't really know how to approach it, issues of equity besides as an important dimension of our field rather than a central dimension of our field. So April 8th, a lot of the conversations around things like open streets were, how do we marry the new public health information we're getting about how COVID-19 is spread with the needs of our citizens or essential workers? What we weren't talking about as much were how do we center the needs of the people in these actual neighborhoods? That kind of came to a head, I would say, around April 14th, 26 days after the lockdown, which if you know anything about how long it takes to get a street improvement made during the normal times is like a millisecond in urban planning, in the urban planning world. Oakland instituted what became their Slow Streets program. That was ultimately 74 miles of streets that were closed to intervention with very little public engagement beforehand. I think they did a beautiful job in a lot of ways in Oakland, but they did receive some criticism, feedback, and they did adjust. So that's a theme that we'll be returning to a lot through our conversation. We also saw smaller scale interventions that still got a lot of criticism down the line. So this is one in Boston, like a whole lot of cities around the country, we saw a lot of street closures through signature parks. And then the question became, well, who has access to signature parks? Who is that benefiting? What needs are being met by closing a street that would have otherwise been a commuting route perhaps, and is instead going to be an extension of the park space? There's good and there's bad to it, depending on who you ask and whose needs you're putting at the center of the conversation. Along the shared mobility tip, we saw an enormous number through March of especially private public partnership bike shares and scooter shares. All of these micromobility pilots were giving mobility to essential workers as an alternative to transit, at the same time that we saw these private micromobility companies starting to fall back and reel in their fleets. And this, I know that one of the three revolutions about automation is about automated driving, but it must be said that we, hopefully knock on wood, have seen the death of the beg button during COVID-19. We started seeing automated crossing signals during this period as well. So to say that our focus was how to prevent the spread of COVID-19 on a colorblind basis is pretty fair, but we were publishing some things, and the conversation across the urbanism field was broadening a little bit as well. So, on the same day, we actually published two op-eds, one from Mike Lydon, who is the head of Open Plans. I always forget the name of his, Street Plans, excuse me, his firm. He's one of the US godfathers of tactical urbanism, saying, let's not overthink it. Opening streets is easy. And on the same day, we published something from the Untokening, which is a fantastic collective of Black and brown transportation justice activists who are saying, don't plan future projects at a time when equitable public participation is impossible. That said, there were some structural things that made it very easy for cities to tilt a little bit more towards the don't overthink it side of the spectrum. And there's good and bad to that as well. So NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, released on May 22nd, the Streets for Pandemic Response, which provided cities with a pretty literal blueprint to do things like sidewalk extensions and open streets and things of that nature, which was the result of the accumulated wisdom of all of their member cities over time. As a result, we saw a whole lot in May of the open air cafe, specifically repurposing streets for the commercial realm. So this is one in New York, but that kind of changed, and that conversation changed quite a bit. Oh, I'm sorry, one more slide. We started to see more things. This is another one from the NACTO guide around not just cafe streets, but also market streets, pedestrian streets, play streets, centering the needs of various groups, but not necessarily with an explicit focus on how do we center the needs of underserved groups. NACTO, to their credit, of course, has a consideration that you should perform some form of community engagement, but there wasn't as much guidance in that early edition of the document. That changed, of course, on May 25th when George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis police. And this image is probably the most, I'm never going to forget it. I posted it in several stories where in New York City, these parklets that have been reclaimed as sidewalk cafes were situated right alongside of street level protests. And NACTO, to their credit, did introduce the Streets for Protest guide and started talking about some of the considerations in public space for minimizing police brutality towards protests, towards encouraging free speech through the built form. But it did prompt a lot of introspection in our field and an enormous amount of learning that I will always be grateful for. So we started publishing a lot of pieces that were revisiting some of these like pure out and out advocacy articles that we had been writing. So we started to ask, are these cafes what's the role of them when they are supporting predominantly white-owned businesses, but we're shutting down street vendors who are predominantly Black and brown immigrant communities. I interviewed Mike Lydon, who gave a really generous and wonderful interview that I recommend everyone read about how tactical urbanism can be a tool for equity. How do we start with equity and put that at the center of our lens rather than making it an afterthought or assuming that it's going to be folded in because everybody walks, rolls, takes transit, uses a wheelchair, uses the public realm in some way. And then of course, I have to give a shout out to some of my colleagues of color and the many authors of color whose opinion pieces we had the privilege to publish over the course of this time. We started to have conversations about how to design self-policing streets, how to redo the community engagement process around tactical urbanism so it arrives swiftly and served as an adequate emergency response that it needed to be, but that also was acting as a tool for reparations for these historically disinvested communities, specifically communities of color and those who are low income. And then I was really proud, and we'll hear a little bit about this from Chisara next, to cover NACTO did a fantastic grant program about open streets events that were used specifically as tools for pandemic response and for equity that put both of those feet forward really, really strongly. And you can read about the other projects on this article. I'll share this deck after the presentation. And then this is reaching just a little bit towards the future, but of course, while the street realm is primarily what we're talking about today, there have been bubblings up and accelerations on some of the other revolutions in our 3 Revolutions toolkit. This is a project out of the Twin Cities in Minnesota that is trying to build a car sharing program, specifically an electric shared vehicle program around the needs of low-income residents who are not currently well served by transit, and it doesn't make sense to expand the transit network, at least on a massive scale, to their neighborhood. So I'll just leave that there as a teaser for later. Here's my info one more time, and that's what I've got today.
Thank you so much. That was really, it's fascinating, and I'm looking forward to hearing more, about that as we move into the Q&A. So next, I'm going to invite Chisara Brown from the city of Detroit to share some wisdom about what they've been experiencing there. I know they've been the recipient of the NACTO pandemic response. You can explain that better, but I'm really excited to hear what Chisara has to share. So please, without further ado, please go ahead and get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Chisara Brown with the City of Detroit, a project manager. So I'll be talking about 2 of our efforts that we executed during this COVID-19 pandemic. So before COVID hit, we were working on some streetscape projects. We were getting ready to kick off a transportation master plan and a few other things. And so when COVID happened, our transportation master plan has a campaign called Streets for People. And so they were working on a few projects for that. And then then NACTO posted the NACTO pandemic relief grant. And so we were thinking like, okay, schools are closed, students won't be able to go to school face to face. Some parents, still have to go to work every day. They may not be in a position to stay home with their children and work. So what can we do? What can we create to assist youth and parents during this time? And so Streets for People, through the Transportation Master Plan, we said, okay, well, how about we create Streets for People, Streets for Learning? And so that's what we created through the NACTO grant. So the Streets for People, Streets for Learning program, we closed 4 residential streets throughout the city of Detroit. So we have a central location, we have a southern location. That population is predominantly a Spanish-speaking population. We have an eastern location in the city, and we have a west side location in the city. So we kind of cover a good portion of the city with the 4 street closures. And so with these street closures, they are closed from about 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday, or Monday through Thursday, and about 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. on Fridays. So if I could go to the next slide. So this is one of the street closure locations. So we work with our street maintenance division. They provide like type 3 barricades so that the streets are able to close. And so one of our community partners that we are working with, they have a community house in this particular neighborhood on the corner. And so through our grant, we partnered with 2 community organizations. And the idea is and was, okay, who can we partner with during this time who already has an established relationship and connection with the community and residents, and who have a strong youth engagement. And so we're partnering with one organization called Brilliant Detroit. This is their location that you're looking at on the, well, one of their locations that you're looking at on the screen. At this location, they're going to be doing like physical fitness activities like yoga. They're going to have food distribution, outdoor virtual learning for students or adults who want to come out and, you know, use computers or use some technical stuff out in the street or the park that's adjacent to the community house. They have, this particular organization has 3 of the 4 temporary street closure locations for this program. And it was funny, we had a meeting with the organizations today just to see how things were progressing, what were some lessons learned. And so one of the stories that came out was that there is a little boy who lives in the area who was having, you know, some difficulties with learning and handling his emotions during the pandemic. And so with this program and residents being able to come out and participate in different things, the neighborhood and the community organization rallied around him to let him know, like, you know, everything is going to work out, everything is going to be okay. And they're going to be painting a mural on the side of the community house, which is on the corner of this street, and it's going to feature him. So it's going to feature his face. So there have been like a lot of just cool things birthed from this project in terms of just community relationships between the city and community partners and the city and residents. One of the other locations that we are going to be having this type of program is on the south side, like I mentioned, of Detroit, where there's a Spanish speaking population, and they're also going to have a street mural. One of the other things that came from this time is our outdoor dining program. So compared to some of the other cities that I've heard talk about, you know, their outdoor dining program, I know sometimes like when you're in a space, you can feel like, man, we're so far behind, but actually Detroit has a really strong outdoor dining program. Typically there is a lot of red tape. You know, you have to go through council approvals, you have to get all of these approvals from like the health department, building and safety, our public works department for securing sidewalk or lane space. And so this year, due to COVID, we decided to cut out a lot of that. We were trying to figure out what are ways that we could allow businesses to open safely so that they're not hurting too bad financially. And one of the things that we did was we eliminated our permit fee. So typically there's a permit fee that you have to pay at the beginning of every year, and you renew your permit every year, and there's a fee associated with that. So the fees were eliminated this year. There wasn't a requirement for the businesses to submit like all this paperwork with their site plans and approvals and things like that. We created a web form that allowed businesses to go online, submit their information. They could request a sidewalk use, they could request parklet use, and they could request temporary street closure requests. So the pictures that you see in this slide is an example of a brewery who has a parklet. So the parklet is occupation of a parking lane. So you could set up, you know, picnic tables or any type of tables that follow our design guidelines. We have another restaurant or business here shown, they have a temporary street closure where you see the umbrellas. And then the picture above that where you see a barrel and stools, that's also a temporary street closure. And that location actually is is at one of our streetscape locations. So this is in the downtown area. We're able to close off the road. There are a few distilleries in the area, so they bring out a like mobile cocktail bar outside, and people are able to sit. And one of the things that we are moving toward now, and actually I believe it just got approved today or Monday, we are extending our outdoor dining season. So typically the season starts in March and then it goes to November 30th. This year for the first time, so this is just like our youth program and working with community organizations, is uncharted territory. We'll be allowing businesses to open up for outdoor dining in the winter months. So they'll be able to apply for that program if they want to participate, get the automatic approval for sidewalk use if they want to use a parklet or a temporary street closure. That has a little bit more of a review time. But in general, the businesses are happy because they don't have to go through all the things that they had to go through prior. And we were able to service we had 180 applications. And so for this program, and about 75% or more are actually operating. And so we hope to be able to continue that going forward, as well as our temporary street closure program through the NACSO grant, and working with community and youth. We're hoping to be able to replicate that throughout the city, and not with just the 4 locations that we started with.
Should I go ahead, Molly?
Oh, sorry, excuse me. Yes, thank you so much for that. And certainly take it away, Nico. Yes, please
Sure.
share your slides.
Sure.
And yeah, thank you. Really great to see what's happening in Detroit. I mean, I wonder what the winter will bring. We'll have to discuss that during the Q&A.
Great. And can you all see my screen? Are you seeing my?
Yep, we see it loud, all clear.
Full screen?
Yep.
Great.
That's great.
All right. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this. I really appreciate it. And great presentations. So I'm going to be talking a little about, so I'm from the Urbanism Next Center here at the University of Oregon, where we look at the impacts of new mobility, AVs, e-commerce on cities. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing on COVID and what this means for public space. So as I mentioned, what we look at Urbanism Next is these technologies, but not so much interest in the technologies, more what the impact is going to be on cities themselves. We've developed something called the Urbanism Next Framework, which looks at those forces of change that are listed there, which we really think of as disruptions, and the impact it's going to have on land use, on urban design, building design, transportation, real estate, and then implication it has across equity, health, environment, economy. And we realized in about April that COVID is just another one of these disruptions. So figuring out what it is, the implications of these things, we've been doing research on since April, looking at what the implications is going to be across all these things. And I invite you to urbanismnext.org to find out more about that. As we knew before COVID, streets are places, absolutely, and they're also contested spaces. You know, all these innovations that are happening, that have been happening around new mobility and e-commerce are really putting a lot of pressure on streets to figure out how we can use those, and on the one hand, really wonderful, more active uses, but also putting a lot of pressure on the number of different groups that are trying to use that thing. I'm going to quickly go through just a little bit of the work that we just put out. We just put out 2 reports on COVID-19 impacts, one looking at this first part, larger impacts, then another one looking at the impacts across the Urbanism Next framework, and I invite you to go look at these. But some of these things have already been talked about, so I'll go over it somewhat quickly. what are the impacts that we're seeing that are really going to affect the way that we all move around in cities and the way that we think of public space? Well, one of the biggest ones is work from home. 42% of the labor force is working from home right now. Huge shifts in where we spend our time and how we move around. Just as importantly, not everyone is doing that, right? So about 50% of the population in the US cannot work from home. That is either because they are essential workers and their bodies are needed. They need to be in the place that they're actually working, out in the world, not in their houses. It could be that sometimes they don't have the technology is not available to certain workers to be able to do this from home. Sometimes you have people like kids at home. Sometimes you have people who are sick. So all this is reducing limits the number of people who can work from home. With that, we're seeing huge reductions in the work trips. 40% reduction in work trips that we're seeing around the country. 77% of the total trips that are happening across the country have dropped. So a huge drop overall in the amount of travel that we're seeing overall. I think most people know about this. Again, huge drops in transit. We're at 27% of where we were before the pandemic. Large implications on equity with this, obviously. And we're seeing big shifts, which was talked about a little bit before, in bike use. Huge increase in bike use for cities that didn't have a lot of bike use. Some of the cities like Portland and DC, which had a significant amount of bike use, saw less of an increase around after COVID, but lots of increase around the country. This was also mentioned by Key a little bit, that we're seeing really big shifts in what's happening with the micromobility front. Large drop in the number of companies that are offering scooter services. Much larger drop than we've seen some of the docked and dockless bike share, but huge drops across that. Another big piece that we're seeing a lot of change is e-commerce. In the last 5-6 months, we've seen the amount of growth that we were projecting to see in the next 5 years of e-commerce. So just huge growth that's happening around that. And that's having a lot of implications in cities, which we'll talk about in just a bit. Lots of delivery happening. So almost twice as much delivery what was happening before. This is Uber Eats, DoorDash, Postmates. You can see we're steady growth through from 2018 to 2020, and then boom, 100% increase in what's happening now. Think about what that affects public spaces, both from the side of transportation, but also the amount of people who are spending the time in public space. It's estimated that 100,000 restaurants are going to be permanently closed due to COVID. This is a huge, again, think about public space, and some of the efforts that were just being talked about are to try to reduce this number. And then we're also seeing retail vacancy rates skyrocket. So 9%, 8% before the pandemic, and now it's up to 20%. So think again what this is going to be doing to our public spaces if we have more and more vacant land right around it, vacant buildings. As has been mentioned repeatedly, I think it should be obvious that these impacts are not equitable. Different populations are being affected differently by this, and typically it's following the same lines of things that we've seen historically, right? Which with wider and more affluent areas being less affected, and actually having more over the recovery efforts happening in those areas than places that are marginalized and lower income. So what does all this mean, these impacts I just showed above? What does this mean for public space? How is this going to affect public space? So I'm going to do a really quick recap of a lot of the work that we've done. But one of them is we're about to see a lot more of this. This is already coming at us with e-commerce, huge drops in the number of, a huge increase in the number of stores that are closing. That's even going faster this year. We're very probably going to be seeing the most number of store closings in the history of the country. This will affect communities everywhere, but again, disproportionately in different parts of the city. But this is going to affect us everywhere. And these are, when stores like this shut down, it's not just, I don't have that store to go to anymore. I now no longer have that job anymore. This now becomes blight in our community, large implications. There's a lot more of this that we're seeing. So warehouses are happening all over cities. Amazon's moving more and more into residential areas. So it's not only the large, enormous fulfillment centers outside of metro areas, but looking at a lot of these things happening within communities. Again, these are not buildings that we think of as warm and fuzzy when we think about neighborhoods. A lot of trip generations and not creating a lot of activity on the street itself. We have seen this shift to think of public spaces being used as public space. So our roadways being used for a whole range of different uses. So obviously not just cars, but for bikes as well. And then the whole streeteries and slow streets, all of that. Really interesting case studies from around the country. And, I'm sure everyone, I think Kia mentioned it briefly, but Oakland, being a wonderful case study of a shift from making streets first these kind of streeteries, and then just realizing we just need these to be more like connections. I think Kia was talking exactly about that. Another big shift that we're seeing is from urban cores to neighborhood centers. This is a really big question. If COVID continues for a while and we are no longer going downtown, we're working from home more, then does that change how much the importance of our neighborhood centers are? And being able to access stores, restaurants, amenities that are within our town centers, neighborhood centers, and not simply the downtown. This could be a big shift in how we think about public space and place. So in terms of what will stick, I'm going to go through this quickly. We can talk about this more in the Q&A, but not knowing everything about the future doesn't mean we don't know anything about the future. So yes, none of us know exactly how this is going to play out, but there's a lot of things that we can look at, and I won't go through these in detail right now, but that are going to affect what sticks around. The length of time that we're in this, that we're overcoming a lot of entry barriers, some large decision points of, do I buy another car, or where do I move to, which will affect long-term impacts. And then I really want to kind of jump to policy decisions and the way that we work. And this is something that's tremendously interesting that we're working, we're talking with cities all over the country, and a real shift in how it is that they are working. And I think the examples that we just heard in both presentations really signify a substantial shift to how cities are working. So we're actually preparing right now a presentation workshop for NACTO. I hope some of you come to NACTO's conference. We're working with the cities of Oakland, Portland, Charlotte, and Salt Lake City, along with Alta. We're organizing this with Alta. That really talks about how it is they've changed what they work. And to summarize it quickly, if historically what we've done in cities is thought about planning, and then some big planning effort, hopefully community engaged, and then 2 to 5 years to 10 years of implementation afterwards, what we've realized is that planning and uncertainty can't work like that. And I would say this was true pre-COVID with what we were seeing with the changing landscape of the three revolutions, everything we're seeing with new mobility, AVs, e-commerce. But it's definitely true now. If it was kind of true before, it's definitely true now. So we need to think about a different way of planning in this uncertainty, which is, first of all, you don't plan to figure out what project you're going to do. You figure out what your desired outcomes are longer term, because you don't know exactly how you're going to get to those desired outcomes. And then instead of just implementation, and this, again, the examples that we just heard from are exactly the shift in way of thinking of, instead of just plan and implement, you plan and then you pilot, you evaluate, and then you pivot. And repeat that thing, pilot, evaluate, pivot over and over again to figure out how we can make our way through, like figure out in a changing situation, how you can react in ways that are continually going to get you towards those desired outcomes. This means that you need continuous community involvement as opposed to just in the plan at the beginning phase, because you need to have community involved in thinking about the pilots, in the evaluation, and then how it is that you pivot. And with this process, every once in a while, you're going to kick off these longer term, more, we'll say, more substantial or more regular or type of outcomes, be it new policy or regulations, pilot scale-ups, new initiatives, these types of things. But this is a really different way of thinking. And I'll tell you, it's really exciting as we talk with cities all over the country, that this shift in way of thinking, which, as I said, I believe needed to happen anyway, is really leading to iterating much, much faster, trying things out, and I think much more of a chance that some of the positive things that we're seeing are actually going to stick in cities. I invite you to take a look at some of the additional resources we have at Urbanism Next. That's urbanismnext.org. We have the Nexus, which looks at all those different aspects of the framework that I mentioned before. We have a whole lot of work we've done specifically on COVID-19. We have a whole section of the website on that. And then these two reports we just put out, again, at urbanismnext.org. And then if you're interested, we've worked with a number of different organizations, including NUMO and TNO and World Economic Forum, to put together the COVID Mobility Works. NACTO is part of that as well, which has a whole list of ways that that cities are reacting to what's happening with COVID. And with that, I'll look forward to answering your questions and have conversation.
Thank you so much, Nico. Oops. And I'll invite all the panelists to turn back on their video for our Q&A section of our webinar. So thank you so much to everyone. I really appreciate those sort of framing comments here. The first question I actually have for the panel, and then I see that there's a number of really great questions in the Q&A, so we'll turn to those too. So continue to add your questions to the Q&A. But the first question I want to ask is kind of personal. I just want to know, just to think about streets and how you experience streets. Do you have memories of the streetscape from your childhood? Can you share something about that maybe informs the work you do today? I'll ask Kia, will you get us started?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up all over the urban Midwest, but more specifically, I started my life in an inner ring suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, where I think I had the incredible privilege to have a street that could double not just as a place for cars to drive, but for me to play with my neighbors and all of those good things that I think we as urbanists talk about all the time when we are thinking about streets not just as a multimodal space, but as a multi-purpose space. And then my family's fortunes changed at a certain point in my life, and we started moving further and further out into the rural suburbs, where, you know, by the time I was about 11 or so, we were living off the side of a rural state-owned highway that my parents did not allow me to bike down at any point. And certainly that was the place where cars went, and I had to be in the yard, and I had the privilege of having a yard. So yeah, I would say that my childhood experiences absolutely shape the way that I think about how we approach this conversation around streets for pandemic response in particular, because, you know, where my parents lived did not see an open streets event, obviously, because that is a major freight corridor. It's necessary for it to be so. But it also is helping me rethink about how we can put the needs of people who live in more rural areas at the center of these conversations, and think about how to meet them where they are. If, you know, my folks are pretty much drive into a park these days, and they appreciate having a little bit of extra space to social distance at a major state park, and that's their streets for pandemic response. It doesn't look like it does for me here in St. Louis, Missouri, where I live now. So that's a short answer.
Chisara, would you like to speak to this question?
Yes, so my childhood memories of playing on the street or sidewalk don't exist because I was not allowed to. In the area that I grew up, it was very busy. It was a major bus route. That's one thing. So the direction of the street went east and west. So there was one lane east and one lane west. So it was very narrow. And for safety, outside of safety reasons in regards to like vehicle traffic, it was also a crime thing. My parents were very, you know, cautious, and there were certain things and certain activities going on in the neighborhood, and they were like, no, we don't want you going, you know, in the street or on the sidewalk to play. You can play in the driveway. So when I hear people discuss, like, you know, like their childhood memories of playing outside in that way, I didn't do that in my neighborhood. Now I will go to my grandparents' neighborhood. They lived on another side of town. So I was born and raised in Detroit. My grandparents also lived in Detroit. And we could go outside and play over there. It wasn't a very busy street. All the neighbors knew each other. People, you know, were always outside talking. So it was two very different environments. So I have two different memories going, you know, in certain areas where it was okay to play outside. In my neighborhood where I spent, you know, the majority of my time, it was not okay for me to go outside. Were there children playing outside there? Yes, but everybody was kind of like in their space. You didn't see too many kids like going up and down the street or anything like that. Is that street now looks the same. In fact, there aren't as many children in that area now. So in terms of it still being very busy, it's still very busy. It's still a major bus route. But one thing that I can say through the NACTO grant, that neighborhood, the neighborhood that I grew up in, has the same footprint as some of the other streets that we're temporarily closing. So in terms of like how we're responding during COVID and how we hope to be able to respond going forward is not making, you know, residential areas so car centric. And being that Detroit is known to be the motor city, we are focusing our efforts on, you know, making transit options more equitable, not just for, you know, cars and people who can afford to drive a car, but people who want to bike, people who want to walk, you know, a place for children to be able to go outside safely and play and engage. So that's my experience.
That's really great. And I think that, I mean, it's great to hear your story, because I think it reminds us that there's such a stark contrast between different places, you know. And Nico, would you like to add anything to this?
Yeah, stark contrast here. So I was actually born in Buenos Aires in Argentina, in a thriving metropolis, but then moved to Houston, Texas, where I lived in suburbia. And it's kind of interesting because, you know, we were talking before this, Molly, about, you know, the streets we grew up on, and we grew up out in the street running around all the time in the suburbs. And it's kind of interesting because if you would have asked me what were streets for, I don't know if I would have said cars anywhere near like the first, you know, 20 things we would do out on them. Growing up, and you know, a lot of the work we do professionally now, we realize the importance of sustainability, how density is really important for so many different reasons, for equity and sustainability. And so a lot of the work I think I do is like trying to figure out how can we get streets that let us do all those wonderful things, but still allow us to have the density and more activity happening on them.
Right, exactly. So I think, so let's think about why the streets were designed the way they were and why they differed so much, I think, you know, in terms of, so just to unpack this, and then we can look at the future. So first, let's look back, and then we can look forward. So first, let's think about the motivations for traffic engineers and street designers of sort of yesteryear, like when they were thinking about developing streets that were so auto-centric. We're looking at Detroit, Houston, other places which are so car dominated. You know, what were their motivations, and how do you think that are those mindsets shifting, and how can we look at those their actions to, you know, to sort of shift the narrative there? Does anyone want to address? Yeah, please.
So I'll speak in regards to Detroit again, being that it was dubbed the Motor City. In my opinion, during certain time periods, when we think about when highways and freeways were constructed, a lot of times the idea or the thought was, okay, how can we get people who don't live in the city to come in the city and feel safe coming into the city? And here we have freeways, you know, and highways to get a certain population from one place to another place, and to get them there quickly, to get them there and they feel comfortable and they feel safe. We still have those conversations now, in terms of restoring public space and restoring city grids and restoring neighborhoods. Part of that conversation sometimes is uncomfortable because we have to peel back like historic layers of why things were done, whether they were done politically, whether they were, you know, for social reasons, for financial reasons. I think the pretty way of saying it is would be just to focus on, okay, let's get one group from A to B safely so that they feel safe. Right. But there's so much more to that than just that, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you. That makes sense. So Kia, or would you like to speak to this at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. And I feel my perspective, like Chisara, I come from a Rust Belt city in St. Louis. When you talk about the motivations of planners past, we're talking about redlining, we're talking about slum clearance, we're talking about the Federal Highway Act being used as a very flimsy pretext to destroy Black and brown communities. We are talking about racism in pretty stark terms. And I think we're talking about a lot of the same things today, of course, but we're also juggling a lot of the questions about how, especially in disinvested Midwestern cities, I think I'll just stick to that since the whole country is a big question. We're talking about how to bring investment back, which is a challenging question when investment is perceived to be something that is out there rather than a population that and an energy that we can harness right now, and we can ask them what they need in order to thrive in place where they are already planted. So I guess in my field, the tension that we often talk about is like the Robert Moses of it all, the adherence of people who in the mid-century wanted to use highways as a tool to modernize places quickly and had a very specific definition of modernizing and what it means, versus the Jane Jacobs of it all, which is a little bit more responsive and organic. And I think these days, I think there are problems with both models, and a lot of my education in that came in just the last 8 months. So we can talk more about that in the Q&A. I'll just kind of tease it for now.
So I'll just jump in and say, I think it's more or less, it comes from a functionalist kind of idea that what are streets for? They're to move cars to get you from point A to point B. And even though I think we oftentimes scoff at that, there was good reasons to be doing that at the time. I think it was just a misguided definition of what the problem was, right? Our streets aren't just to move cars. Streets are for people, and to even move, it's not even moving cars, it's moving people through them, and that they're not only places to go through, but they're places to be as well. And I think that's like one of the wonderful things that's happened, I'd say, in the last 2 decades here in this country and all over the world, is just this realization that you have to reframe what the problem is. The problem's not about moving cars, it's about creating spaces for people. And gives me hope that a lot of the stuff that we're actually seeing right now with COVID is this understanding that streets have all these different purposes and roles and programs.
Absolutely. I think this is so many good perspectives. Thank you all so much for sharing. So I think let's turn quickly to so we've done some sort of juxtaposition about Jane Jacobs versus Robert Moses. I think so is this sort of street, a dense urban center with active streets, still our goal, or are we looking at a different set of goals, and more maybe a more diverse set of goals as well? What does the active street mean today? It's a pretty big open question, I understand, but I just want to sort of unpack this a little bit more.
I think when I think of Jane Jacobs and thinking about, what was it that she said, like the streets or sidewalks being like a ballet of people or something like that. I feel like I have that lofty idea, and I think possibly, I think that's going to mean something different to each person based on your experience. And I think I would like to say vibe or gel well with that perspective because I didn't experience that. And it's something that when I did finally experience it, I was like, oh, this is great. This is wonderful. This is how it's supposed to be. Because I think that there is a certain level of freedom and connectedness you feel to the space that you're in, to the people that you're around. Again, like I said, growing up, I didn't feel that freedom. I didn't feel that connectivity. I just knew like, I cannot go over there. I cannot do that because there's a bus coming or there's a car coming. I didn't always feel like there was space for me. And one of the things that, and I like, it's definitely a balance that I think about when we talk about designing roads and spaces. If it's safe enough for a child, then it's safe enough for everyone. And I take that perspective when I think about what it's supposed to be like or what it's supposed to feel like.
Yes, that's right on. So I know this is like a really good question that everyone probably wants to answer, but I'd like to address some of the other questions in the Q&A, and maybe we can bring in this topic in those questions as well. An important question that was asked by Prashant about this sort of tension between tactical urbanism and the reuse of streets and the needs of people with in wheelchairs or with vision disabilities. is this something that has come up, Kia, for you or Chisara in Detroit? Is this a topic that you've discussed around sort of how to make sure that we're meeting ADA needs as well as new needs?
Yeah, I'll just jump in first if that's okay. It's absolutely something that we talked about, and it's something that's personal to me because I'm a person with invisible disabilities. Most of my invisible disabilities make it challenging for me to drive, so I don't really fit the narrative around wheelchair users and things like that. But one of the earliest articles that we published in response to the open cafes movement is how abysmal our cities are already at ADA compliance when it comes to sidewalk cafes, and how little thought is being given in so many of our cities towards people who are specifically using mobility assistive devices and need more of the sidewalk space, and why we need to use that as a launching pad to say we need more of the street real estate in order to accommodate many uses, rather than saying we need less, and it's if we can't have space for this particular use, we can't have the other. So I see a lot of the programs that are coming out right now around Streets for Pandemic Response as better in terms of disability and different ability compliance, in the sense that we're seeing a lot of attention paid to how our notions of disability should be more expansive. And a lot of our mobility disabilities are people with mobility disabilities can't drive by their nature and are very well served actually by even some of these recreational amenities and things like that. So yeah, it's very close to my heart, and it's something that I would love to talk to you about more if you email me, because we're trying to up our coverage of that.
Great. Well, that sounds like people whose questions aren't answered today could also reach out to some of our panelists with additional questions. I'll turn it to Nico to kind of to close us out here. There's a question that was asked, if our travel and work habits permanently changed, and if so, why invest in public transit? It's a tough question to answer in 1 minute, but that's all we have today, unfortunately. So please help us answer this extremely difficult question.
All right, so I'll try to do it really quick. So even if our transportation habits change, our transportation is not going away. We're still going to want to move, and we're still going to need to move. And the question is, how do we do that in the way that's the most efficient, the most sustainable, and the most equitable? And I think to answer all those things, transit is always the best answer. And so I do not see, even if we reduce the amount of transportation we're doing, especially work from home, like fantastic, we still move around a whole lot. I mean, even right now, we're reduced, but we're at 77%. That's still a lot of trips. And if you look historically, you don't have to go back that many years to find that we were, what we're doing right now is what used to be the maximum amount. So transit, for all the reasons that it helps us on sustainability, equity, and efficiency, I think is absolutely the right way for us to be going. And so a huge sadness for me would be if transit is one of the fatalities of COVID. We really need to find a way to make sure that it continue to survive and continue to be there for after we're done with this pandemic.
Right, absolutely. Well, I'll allow, I really encourage each of you to provide just a closing remark as well. So Chisara, would you like to provide any closing thoughts?
I would just say, I hate to center everything around COVID, but because that's just the space that we're in right now, just for everybody to just continue to be intentional with their work and to be purposeful, because I know that's one of the things that we're trying to do in Detroit, not only with this NACTO grant, but just with all of our projects, be intentional about the communities that we're serving and the work that we're doing, and making sure that, we're putting our best foot forward.
Yes, exactly. Kia, would you like to have any closing remarks?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add is that as a journalist covering this, the most inspiring work I've seen around Streets for Pandemic Response have been from communities that were trying not to balance equity and public health, but were amplifying both mutually. And I think that's sort of the challenge of our moment, is how do we not say open streets in the past have had a corrosive impact on communities of color, we should never do them, but instead to say, how can we use all the tools in our toolkit as tools to accomplish our goals? So I think it's really important that we keep this conversation going. I encourage you all to reach out to us at Streets Blog and tip us stories about projects that you see not threading the needle, but trying to sew a new quilt, to give a terrible metaphor.
I like that. Oh man, great panel. I mean, really, you all are doing the real hard work, and I really, I learned so much more about Detroit, about the work that Streets Blog's doing, about Urbanism Next. Really, I feel lucky to be a part of this group of great people. So thank you all for bringing some wisdom to us, and we could continue on. So if you, like I said, we'll send out the slides from the presentations today, and we'll look at the questions and try to summarize them on our website. We try to do a summary of the presentations and some of the unanswered and answered questions that weren't got to today. So thank you all for joining me, and I'll close the webinar there. Please reach out. I put our link to our events page in the chat, so you can keep that on hand and check in as we publish more events going forward. We're planning on doing a monthly webinar. So thank you so much, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Maybe try to get out onto your street.
Thank you, Molly.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.